The December wind cut through the pines like cold truth, rattling the windows of the lakehouse. Caroline and I had called home for 32 years. I stood at the kitchen sink, washing the same coffee mug I'd used every morning since her funeral 3 years ago. The blue ceramic one with the tiny chip on the handle that she'd refused to throw away. "It gives it character," she used to say, running her thumb over the imperfection, the way she did with everything broken that still had use left in it. Outside, Clearview Lake stretched like hammered pewter under the winter sky. The dock where we'd shared our morning coffee for 3 decades stood empty now, the Adirondack chairs stacked and covered until spring. Everything about this place held her fingerprints, her choices, her laughter echoing in rooms that felt too large for one man, but too precious to abandon. The sound of gravel crunching in the driveway pulled me from my thoughts. Through the frost-etched window, I watched a black SUV roll to a stop beside my old Ford pickup. The engine's quiet hum spoke of something expensive, something that required monthly payments I'd never needed to make. My son Ethan emerged from the driver's side, his charcoal wool coat immaculate against the December gray. At 42, he moved with the confident stride of a man who expected doors to open for him, problems to solve themselves, and fathers to comply with whatever arrangements he'd made without consultation. Madison stepped out from the passenger side, her blonde hair arranged in one of those casual styles that takes an hour to achieve. Her cream-colored coat probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check, and she wore it like armor. Behind them, 2 figures unfolded from the back seat, with the careful movements of people who'd grown accustomed to being accommodated, Gerald and Patricia Monroe. Madison's parents dressed in the kind of understated elegance that announces wealth without shouting it. I dried my hands on the dish towel, one of Caroline's worn soft from years of use, and watched them approach the front door. They moved like a delegation, each step deliberate, each glance calculated. Gerald surveyed the property with the appraising eye of a man who saw square footage and lakefront footage where I saw home. Patricia clutched her leather handbag like a shield, her mouth set in the kind of smile that had nothing to do with happiness. The knock came firm and measured the sound of people who'd rehearsed this moment. I opened the door before they could knock again, partly from old habit and partly because waiting felt like giving them permission to think they owned my time as well as my attention. "Dad." Ethan's smile was bright and brittle, the kind of expression that looked genuine until you'd seen it enough times to recognize the mechanics underneath. "Hope you don't mind us dropping by." "Your house," Madison added quickly, her voice carrying that particular sweetness that always preceded requests for favors I wouldn't want to grant. "We brought hot chocolate." I stepped back to let them enter, noting how Gerald's eyes immediately began cataloging the stone fireplace I'd built by hand, the custom entertainment center, the hardwood floors Caroline and I had refinished during one sweltering summer when Ethan was away at college. Patricia's gaze lingered on the family photographs arranged on the mantel, her expression suggesting she was already mentally rearranging them. "Coffee's fresh," I offered, because Caroline had trained me to be a host even when every instinct suggested otherwise. "Actually, Dad," Ethan said, settling into what had always been Caroline's chair without invitation. "We wanted to talk to you about something important, about the future." Madison perched beside him on the sofa we'd bought for our 20th anniversary, the one Caroline had reupholstered herself in soft green fabric that reminded her of spring moss. Gerald and Patricia arranged themselves with the practiced ease of people accustomed to being accommodated, their presence transforming my living room into something that felt like a conference room. "The future," I repeated, settling into my own chair, the leather recliner that had molded itself to my shape over 15 years of evening news and Sunday afternoon naps. "Your future specifically," Patricia said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that suggested she was accustomed to having her opinions treated as facts. "We've been discussing your situation here, Richard. This big house, all this space, all these memories." And she spoke about memories like they were cluttered to be cleared out obstacles to efficient living, rather than the accumulated treasures of a life shared. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not quite anger yet, but its close cousin, the kind of chill that comes when you realize you're being managed rather than loved. "My situation seems fine to me," I said carefully, my voice carrying the steady tone I'd learned in 40 years of construction work when you needed to sound reasonable while dealing with unreasonable people. Gerald leaned forward, his silver hair catching the lamplight, his expression carrying the practiced concern of a man who'd learned to disguise acquisitiveness as care. Richard, we're family now. We look out for each other. And frankly, we're worried about you rattling around in this place all alone. Rattling around, as if my presence in my own home was somehow excessive, somehow inappropriate. As if the rooms where Caroline and I had built our life together were now too large for the man left behind to inhabit them properly. We've found the perfect solution. Madison continued, her smile brightening, as if she were announcing a lottery win, rather than delivering what felt increasingly like an eviction notice. Gerald and Patricia need a place to stay. Their lease is up next month, and housing costs in the city have become impossible. It's perfect timing, really. I looked at each of them in turn, seeing the careful choreography of this moment, the way their expressions had been arranged to suggest this was a wonderful coincidence rather than a calculated solution to a problem I hadn't known existed. Perfect timing for what? For them to move in here. Ethan said, his voice carrying that particular blend of patience and condescension that had crept into his tone sometime after Madison's family had entered his life. It's a win-win situation, Dad. They get a beautiful place to live, you get company, and everyone benefits. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire I couldn't quite locate. I thought of Caroline's morning routine, the way she'd hum while arranging flowers from her garden, the particular spot by the bay window where she'd sit with her knitting, while winter storms turned the lake rough and gray. I thought of the workshop where I'd built most of our furniture, the guest bedroom, where we'd hoped grandchildren would someday sleep, the dock, where we'd watched 40 years of sunsets paint the water gold. What about what I want? I asked quietly. The question seemed to catch them off guard, as if my preferences were a variable they hadn't considered important enough to calculate. Ethan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Madison's smile faltered for just a moment before reassembling itself. Dad. Ethan said, his voice taking on the gentle firmness of someone explaining something obvious to someone, slow to understand. You're 73 years old. This house is too big, too isolated. What if something happened? What if you fell, had another heart episode? We're trying to think ahead to make sure you're taken care of. Taken care of. The phrase sat heavy in the room, suggesting I was no longer capable of taking care of myself, that my autonomy was a luxury the family could no longer afford to indulge. I touched the pocket watch Caroline had given me on our wedding day, feeling its familiar weight against my chest. I appreciate the concern. I said, though, appreciation was perhaps the least accurate word for what I felt, but I'm not ready to give up my home. Gerald's laugh was polite but dismissive, the sound a man makes when he's already decided the outcome of a negotiation. Richard, be practical. You're living in the past. Caroline's gone. God rest her soul, but you can't stay frozen in time. People your age need to start thinking about downsizing, about making smart decisions while they still can. While they still can. The implication hung between us, like a blade that my capacity for making smart decisions was finite, declining, soon to be exhausted. That perhaps it already had been. Patricia reached for her purse, extracting a folder thick with papers. We've done some research, found some lovely senior communities. Places where you'd have people your own age, activities, medical care nearby. You wouldn't have to worry about maintenance, yard work, all the burdens of keeping up a place this size. I stood, moving to the window that faced the lake. The December light was failing, painting the water deep blue, the color it turned just before winter claimed it completely. In the distance, a loon called, once its voice wild and lonely and free. This house isn't a burden, I said without turning around. It's home. It's just a house, Dad, Ethan said, and something in his voice suggested he'd been waiting to say those words for a long time. Mom's not here anymore. Holding on to this place isn't going to bring her back. I turned then, slowly, deliberately, and looked at my son, really looked at him, the boy who'd helped me build the dock, who'd stood beside me in this very room when the doctor called to say Caroline's tests had come back clear, who'd cried in my arms after her funeral. That boy was gone, replaced by this stranger in expensive clothes who spoke about our home like it was a piece of real estate to be liquidated. You're right, I said quietly. She's not coming back. But this is where she lived, where we lived, where every room holds 32 years of marriage. Sentiment doesn't pay property taxes, Madison said, her sweetness finally giving way to something sharper. Or cover maintenance costs. Or handle emergencies. You're being impractical, Richard. I poured myself a cup of coffee from the pot I'd made that morning, adding nothing to it, letting the bitter warmth settle my thoughts. Outside, snow had begun to fall, small flakes that caught the porch light like ash from a distant fire. "What if I said no?" I asked. The silence that followed was profound, the kind that reveals truths people had hoped to keep hidden. Gerald shifted in his seat. Patricia's fingers tightened on her purse. Madison's mouth opened slightly as if the possibility of refusal was so unexpected she needed extra air to process it. Ethan recovered first, his smile returning, but colder now, more mechanical. "Dad, let's not make this harder than it needs to be. We're family. Family helps family. And right now, Gerald and Patricia need help." "What about what I need?" "You need to be realistic," he said. And there it was, the edge of impatience that had been lurking beneath his practiced concern all evening. "You need to stop clinging to things that are too big for you to handle alone." I set my coffee cup down with the kind of care that suggested I was making a decision, not just clearing space on the table. "I think," I said slowly, "that you should all go home, to your own homes." The words created their own weather in the room, a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the December air seeping through the windows. Gerald's face flushed red above his expensive sweater. Patricia's mouth pinched into a line so thin it seemed to disappear entirely. Madison's eyes flashed with something that looked remarkably like hatred before she caught herself and rearranged her expression into wounded disappointment. But it was Ethan's reaction that cut deepest. He stood smoothing his coat with the kind of deliberate movements that suggested he was controlling himself with considerable effort. When he looked at me, his eyes held something I'd never seen there before. Not anger exactly, but something colder. Calculation. "You're making a mistake, Dad," he said quietly. "A big one. We're trying to help you, and you're being stubborn for no good reason." "My reasons are good enough for me." He walked to the door, the others following in a formation that suggested this retreat had been planned for practice even. At the threshold, he turned back, and for just a moment, his mask slipped completely. "This isn't over," he said. "You can't keep us out forever." The door closed behind them, with a sound like a coffin lid settling into place. I stood in the sudden quiet of my living room, listening to their voices fade as they walked to their expensive SUV, listening to the engine start and the gravel crunch as they drove away into the winter night. I picked up my coffee cup, noting that my hands were steady despite the adrenaline singing in my bloodstream. Through the window, I watched their taillights disappear around the curve, leaving me alone with the snow and the silence and the growing certainty that something fundamental had just shifted in the architecture of my life. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 times, its voice steady and reliable, marking time, in a house that was still mine, but felt somehow less secure than it had that morning. I touched Caroline's photograph on the mantel, her smile as warm and constant as it had been in life. "They want to take our home," I whispered to her image. "Our son wants to give it away." The photograph offered no advice, but I could imagine what she'd say if she could. Caroline had never been one to back down from a fight, especially when the stakes mattered. She'd fought the insurance company when they'd tried to deny coverage for my heart surgery. She'd fought the county when they'd wanted to rezone our road for commercial development. She'd fought her cancer with grace and determination until the very end. I walked through the house, turning off lights, checking locks, performing the small rituals that marked the end of another day. In our bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed we'd shared for 47 years and felt the weight of the evening settle around me like a shroud. They'd be back. Ethan's parting words weren't a threat exactly, but they weren't a promise to respect my decision either. They were a statement of intent, a declaration that this was merely the opening skirmish in a war I hadn't known I was fighting. I opened the drawer of the nightstand and pulled out the manila folder where I kept our important papers, the deed to the house insurance policies, Caroline's will my own. The deed felt heavier than it should have, its official language suddenly precious in a way it had never been before. The house was mine, bought and paid for. No mortgage, no liens, no legal obligation to anyone but myself. But legality and family were different territories governed by different laws. In the country of blood and obligation, Ethan seemed to believe he held claims that superseded any document. I was wrong about that, of course, but it would take time to prove it. Snow continued to fall outside, covering the deck where Caroline and I had shared so many morning coffees, covering the garden where she'd coaxed roses to bloom, despite the challenging soil covering the whole property in a blanket of white that made everything look clean and peaceful and deceptively simple. Tomorrow I would begin to understand exactly what I was up against. Tonight I sat in the quiet of the home Caroline and I had built together and listened to the grandfather clock mark time with the patience of something that had weathered many storms and intended to weather many more. The fight, I realized, had only just begun. Comment 200 if you want a sequel. The morning after brought the kind of brittle clarity that follows a sleepless night spent thinking. I woke before dawn, not from any sound or disturbance, but from the strange weight of certainty pressing against my chest. The house felt different, not violated exactly, but somehow less secure, as if the conversation the night before had left cracks in the foundation that hadn't been there when the sun went down. I made coffee in the pre-dawn quiet, my movements automatic, but deliberate. The ritual steadied me, measure the grounds, add the water, wait for the familiar gurgle and hiss that meant another day was officially beginning. Through the kitchen window, Clearview Lake stretched like dark glass, reflecting the first pale hints of sunrise. The snow had stopped sometime during the night, leaving everything covered in a thin white sheet that made the familiar landscape look temporarily erasable. My phone sat silent on the kitchen counter, its black screen offering no messages, no missed calls, no digital acknowledgement that the previous evening had happened at all. In the old days, Caroline would have been up by now, humming softly as she started breakfast, commenting on the snow, planning her day around the weather and the light. The absence of her voice felt particularly sharp in the morning, quiet, a silence that had learned to fill itself with echoes. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and the manila folder I'd retrieved from the nightstand, spreading the contents across the worn wood surface. The deed to the property, dated 32 years ago, bore both our signatures, mine bold and confident, Caroline's careful and precise. The insurance papers, updated annually, listed me as the sole beneficiary after her passing. My will, drawn up by Marcus Henley downtown, clearly specified my intentions for the property to remain in the family, but only if the family proved worthy of it. That last clause had been Caroline's suggestion, added during one of our rare arguments about what would happen to the house after we were both gone. "You can't just assume love will be enough," she'd said, her voice gentle but firm. "Sometimes you have to make sure people understand what they're receiving before they're allowed to receive it." I'd thought she was being overly cautious at the time. Now, staring at the legal documents that proved my ownership beyond any reasonable doubt, I understood that Caroline had seen something I'd missed, the possibility that sentiment and law might someday find themselves in opposition, with our son standing on the wrong side of both. The grandfather clock chimed 7 times, its voice steady and implacable. Somewhere in the distance, a snowplow scraped against asphalt, the county crews beginning their daily battle against winter's accumulated weight. Normal sounds of a normal morning, in a world that no longer felt quite normal to me. I thought about Ethan as a boy, the way he'd follow me around the property during summer visits, chattering about everything and nothing, while I repaired the dock or cleaned the gutters. He'd been curious then, eager to understand how things worked, why certain repairs were necessary, what it took to maintain a place like this. "Will it be mine someday, Dad?" he'd asked once, maybe 8 years old, his small hands dirty from helping me replace a rotted board on the deck. "If you want it," I'd told him, "if you understand what it means to want it." He'd nodded solemnously, the way children do when they sense they're being trusted with adult concepts they don't quite grasp yet. Now I wondered if he'd ever learned to distinguish between wanting something and believing he deserved it without effort. The phone rang at 8:30, its shrill tone cutting through my thoughts like a blade through cloth. The caller ID showed Ethan's number, and I let it ring 3 times before answering, not from hesitation, but from a desire to control the terms of whatever conversation was about to unfold. "Morning, Dad." His voice carried the forced brightness of someone who'd practiced this opening line, someone who'd spent time preparing for rejection and had decided to plow ahead anyway. "Sleep well?" "Well enough," I said, keeping my tone neutral. No anger, no warmth, just the careful flatness of a man who'd learned not to show his cards before he understood the game being played. "Listen, about last night, I think we got off on the wrong foot. Madison's parents, they're just worried about their situation, and we're all trying to figure out what's best for everyone." "What's best for everyone?" The phrase sat heavy in the morning air, loaded with assumptions about who got to define everyone and who got to decide what was best. I sipped my coffee and waited for him to continue, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. The thing is, Dad, we've been thinking about this for a while. The logistics, I mean. How to make it work for everybody. Gerald and Patricia wouldn't just be staying there, they'd help with maintenance yard work. All the things that are getting harder for you to manage. Harder for me to manage. Another assumption, another small erosion of my autonomy, dressed up as practical concern. I looked out at the deck I'd cleared of snow just last week, the gutters I'd cleaned myself in October, the driveway I'd repaired without help the previous summer. I manage just fine, I said. I know you do, I know you're still capable. But, Dad, you're 73. How much longer do you want to be climbing ladders and hauling tools around? Wouldn't it be nice to have help? The question carried its own answer, implied and inevitable. Of course it would be nice to have help. Of course age would eventually require accommodations. But the help Ethan was offering came with strings-attached conditions that felt more like a takeover than assistance. What if I hire help instead? I asked. Maintenance crew cleaning service, whatever I need. Keep the place the way Caroline and I always intended. A pause longer than a conversational beat, shorter than actual consideration. Dad, that's expensive. And it's not the same as having family there, people who care about the place. People who care about the place. I thought about Gerald's appraising gaze the night before, the way he'd surveyed the living room like a real estate agent calculating square footage. I thought about Patricia's obvious plans to rearrange the furniture to erase Caroline's choices and impose her own. I thought about Madison's reference to sentiment not paying property taxes as if love and memory were obstacles to efficient living rather than the reasons for living at all. Ethan, I said, choosing my words with the care of a man defusing a bomb, I need you to understand something. This isn't just a house to me. It's the place where your mother and I built our life together. Every room has memories I'm not ready to share, let alone surrender. You wouldn't be surrendering anything. They're family now. They understand what the place means. Do they? Another pause. This one edged with something sharper. What's that supposed to mean? It means last night felt more like a business meeting than a family conversation. It means your in-laws looked at my home like they were measuring it for new curtains before they'd even been invited to stay. You're being paranoid. The word landed like a slap, quick and stinging, and designed to make me question my own perceptions. Paranoid. As if my reluctance to hand over my home to virtual strangers was evidence of mental decline rather than reasonable self-preservation. Maybe, I said, or maybe I'm being careful. Careful of what? Your own family, your own family. The phrase twisted something in my chest the way Ethan said it with such confidence as if Gerald and Patricia Monroe had somehow become my family through marriage paperwork rather than years of shared experience. As if their needs now superseded my own through some mathematical equation I'd never agreed to calculate. I need time to think, I said finally. How much time? The question came too quickly with too much urgency, suggesting that time was a luxury they couldn't afford to grant me. As much as I need. Dad, their lease is up next month. They need to know where they stand. Then they should have started looking for a place earlier. The silence that followed was different from the previous pauses, harder, colder, filled with the kind of tension that suggested I'd crossed a line I hadn't known existed. When Ethan spoke again, his voice had lost its practiced warmth. You know what? Fine. Take your time. Think it over. But Dad... He paused and I could hear something shifting in his tone, something that sounded less like disappointment and more like a threat. Don't take too long. Things have a way of getting complicated when people dig in their heels for no good reason. The line went dead before I could respond, leaving me holding the phone like evidence of something I couldn't quite name. I set it down carefully and walked to the living room, where the morning light was just beginning to slant through the windows Caroline had loved for the way they framed the lake view. On the mantel, our wedding photo smiled back at me from its silver frame. Caroline in her grandmother's dress, me in the rented tux that had felt too formal for a man who worked with his hands. We looked impossibly young, impossibly hopeful, impossibly certain that love would be enough to weather whatever storms might come. I thought about Ethan's words. Things have a way of getting complicated when people dig in their heels for no good reason. The threat had been subtle but unmistakable, wrapped in the kind of language that allowed plausible deniability while making the consequences clear. They'd be back. Not today, probably not tomorrow, but soon. And when they came, it wouldn't be with hot chocolate and forced smiles. It would be with lawyers maybe, or social workers, or some other form of official pressure designed to make my resistance seem unreasonable rather than righteous. I spent the morning organizing the documents from the manila folder, making copies of everything important, storing the originals in the fireproof safe Caroline had insisted we buy after a neighbor's house fire. The deed, the insurance papers, my will, all the legal proof that this house was mine to keep or give away as I saw fit. But legality, I was beginning to understand, might not be enough. In the country of family obligation, different rules applied. In that territory, Ethan seemed to believe he held claims that superseded any document, any deed, any signature on any piece of paper. The afternoon brought a text message from Madison. "Richard, I hope you'll reconsider. We're only trying to help. Families should stick together." The heart emoji at the end felt particularly calculated, a small digital manipulation designed to make my resistance seem cruel. I didn't respond, but I saved the message, adding it to the growing file of evidence that this wasn't about family helping family. It was about family helping themselves. As evening approached, I made dinner for one, the same simple meal I'd prepared every night since Caroline's passing: grilled chicken, steamed vegetables, a glass of water. The routine comforted me, its predictability a small act of rebellion against the chaos that seemed to be gathering at the edges of my carefully ordered life. I ate at the kitchen table, watching the light fade over Clearview Lake, listening to the house settle around me with its familiar creaks and sighs. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and fell silent. A car passed on the road beyond the trees, its headlights briefly illuminating the snow-covered branches. This was my life now, quiet, solitary, but mine. Mine to keep, mine, to protect, mine to defend against anyone who thought they could take it from me, family or otherwise. Before bed, I called Marcus Henley's office and left a message on his answering machine. "Marcus, it's Richard Dalton. I need to schedule a meeting as soon as possible. Family matter, legal implications. Thanks." The words felt strange in my mouth, formal and final, but they also felt necessary, the first step in a journey I'd hoped never to take but could no longer avoid. That night, I slept better than I had since Caroline's funeral, not because my problems had been solved, but because I'd finally admitted they existed. Sometimes acknowledgement is the first form of action, the moment when a man stops being a victim and starts being a fighter. Tomorrow, I would begin to build the walls that would protect what Caroline and I had created together. Tonight, I rested in the certainty that some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight was against your own blood. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, marking the end of one day and the beginning of whatever came next. In the darkness of the bedroom I'd shared with Caroline for 32 years, I felt her presence like a hand on my shoulder, steady and strong, and absolutely certain that I was doing the right thing. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the tracks left by earlier visitors, erasing the evidence of intrusion, and leaving the property clean and white, and mine. Marcus Henley's office occupied the second floor of a brick building that had weathered 60 years of small-town legal disputes without losing its dignity. The stairs creaked under my feet as I climbed them, Tuesday morning, each step echoing in the narrow hallway like a countdown to something I couldn't quite name. The frosted glass door still bore his name in gold lettering that had begun to fade at the edges, a detail that somehow made me trust him more, not less. Marcus stood when I entered, his handshake firm, despite the arthritis I could see in his knuckles. We'd known each other for 25 years, ever since he'd handled the purchase of the lakehouse property, and his face carried the comfortable familiarity of a man who'd seen me through good times and bad without ever pretending the distinction didn't matter. "Richard," he said, gesturing toward the leather chair across from his desk. "You sounded concerned on the phone." I settled into the chair, noting how the morning light slanted through his windows and painted everything in shades of amber and gold. On his desk, family photographs competed for space with legal briefs and coffee-stained case files, the accumulated debris of a life spent mediating between what people wanted and what the law would allow them to have. "My son wants to move his in-laws into my house," I said without preamble. "Claims it's for everyone's benefit, but it feels more like a takeover than a favor." Marcus leaned back, his fingers steepled in front of his chest, in the posture of a man who'd heard this story before in different variations. "Your house, the lake house property, the one Caroline and I bought in '91. Paid off, clear title, everything properly documented. And Ethan's reasoning? I told him about Christmas night, about the delegation that had arrived with hot chocolate and demands dressed up as concern. I described Gerald's appraising gaze, Patricia's folder full of senior community brochures, Madison's sweet-voiced insistence that sentiment didn't pay property taxes. Marcus listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad, his expression growing more thoughtful with each detail. "They're positioning this as elder care," he said when I finished, "making it sound like they're worried about your capacity to maintain the property, your safety living alone, your need for supervision." The word supervision landed heavily in the room, carrying implications I'd tried not to examine too closely. I'm 73, not 93. I still drive, still do my own shopping, still handle my own finances. I know that, you know that, but in a family dispute, perception can matter as much as reality. Marcus set down his pen and leaned forward. "Richard, I need to ask some difficult questions. Have you had any medical issues recently? Any incidents that might give them ammunition to claim you need assistance? I thought about the heart attack 5 years ago, the brief hospitalization and the medications I took daily to keep my ticker running smoothly. All well documented, all within normal parameters for a man my age, but potentially problematic if presented in the wrong context to the wrong people. Heart condition well managed. Clean bill of health from my last physical 6 months ago. Dr. Patterson says I'm in better shape than most men my age. Good. What about finances? Any joint accounts, shared assets, powers of attorney that might complicate things? Everything's in my name since Caroline passed. No shared accounts with Ethan, no powers of attorney except what's in my will." Marcus made more notes, his handwriting surprisingly neat for a man who'd spent decades scribbling legal observations under pressure. "Tell me about the property itself. Any mortgages, lines, legal complications that might give them a foothold. Bought and paid for. No debt, no liens, no complications. The deed's clean. And your will. How does it currently handle the property?" I'd been dreading this question, partly because the answer revealed how naive I'd been about family loyalty, and partly because it exposed the gap between my intentions and my legal protections. It leaves everything to Ethan with the understanding that he'll preserve the property and its meaning to our family. The understanding. Marcus repeated the phrase with the particular emphasis lawyers use when they encounter assumptions dressed up as legal protections. Not a requirement, not a condition, an understanding. Yes. Richard, you realize that once Ethan inherits the property, he can do whatever he wants with it, sell it, transfer it. Let his in-laws live there permanently. Your understanding won't have any legal weight. The truth settled around me like cold air, obvious once spoken, but somehow invisible while I'd been living with it. I'd assumed that love would be enough to preserve what Caroline and I had built together, that family loyalty would protect the home we'd created from casual disposal or calculated appropriation. I'd been wrong about both. "What are my options?" I asked. Marcus pulled a thick folder from his filing cabinet, the kind that suggested he'd handled similar situations before. "Several, actually. We could restructure your will with specific conditions, requirements that the property remain in family hands for a certain period, restrictions on sale, or transfer penalties for non-compliance. We could create a trust that maintains your control during your lifetime while protecting the property's future. What about now? What if they try to force the issue while I'm still alive? They can't force you to do anything. You're the legal owner, competent to make your own decisions, under no obligation to house anyone you don't want to house." He paused, his expression growing more serious. "But Richard, they could make your life difficult if they are determined enough. Claims of elder abuse through isolation, petitions for guardianship, medical evaluations to assess your competency." The words hit like physical blows, each one carrying the weight of legal precedent and family betrayal combined. They'd really go that far. Depends how much they want what you have, and how desperate they are to get it. I thought about Gerald and Patricia's expensive clothes, their confident assumption that accommodation was their right rather than my choice. I thought about Madison's calculating sweetness and Ethan's barely concealed impatience when I dared to resist their plans. Desperation might not be the right word for what I'd seen in their faces, but entitlement certainly was. "I want to protect the property," I said finally. "Not just for now, but permanently. I want to make sure that if something happens to me, the house doesn't become a commodity to be bought and sold." Marcus nodded, already reaching for forms I couldn't see but could sense waiting in the organized chaos of his filing system. "Then we'll set up a trust. You'll remain the primary beneficiary during your lifetime, with complete control over the property, but we'll build in protections that preserve the house's integrity regardless of what happens to family relationships." "How long will that take?" 2 weeks, maybe 3. I'll need to draft the documents file, the paperwork, make sure everything's legally bulletproof." He looked up from his notes. "Richard, this is going to cost some money. Not a fortune, but not nothing either. You comfortable with that?" I thought about the savings account Caroline and I had built together, the careful accumulation of 40 years of living within our means and planning for the future. Money we'd intended to use for travel, for home improvements, for the grandchildren we'd never had, but always hoped for. Now, it would buy me something more precious than any of those things: the right to remain in my own home on my own terms. "Whatever it costs," I said. The drive home took me past the elementary school, where Ethan had played Little League, the hardware store, where we'd bought the lumber for his treehouse, the ice cream shop, where we'd celebrated his high school graduation. Normal landmarks of a normal childhood in a normal family. Except that normal families didn't usually end up in lawyers' offices discussing protection from their own children. I stopped at the grocery store partly for the milk and bread I actually needed, and partly to delay returning to the house that suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a fortress under siege. In the produce section, I ran into Helen Morrison, an old friend of Caroline's who'd been widowed the year before my wife passed. "Richard," she said, her voice carrying the particular warmth reserved for fellow survivors of long marriages. "How are you managing?" The question was simple enough, but the answer felt complicated in ways I couldn't easily explain. "Getting by," I said, which was true but incomplete. "I heard Ethan was in town over Christmas. It must have been nice to have family around for the holidays." Helen's expression was innocently curious, but something in her tone suggested she'd heard more than just the fact of Ethan's visit. In a town this size, news traveled fast, and the kind of tension that had filled my living room Christmas night was the kind of thing neighbors noticed and discussed. "It was interesting," I said carefully. She studied my face with the sharp attention of a woman who'd learned to read between the lines of what people said versus what they meant. "Richard, if you ever need to talk, or if there's anything I can do to help, you know where to find me." The offer was genuine, and I found myself grateful for it in ways that surprised me. For 3 years, I'd been managing my grief and my solitude as private matters, accepting casseroles and condolences, but keeping the deeper struggles to myself. Now facing the possibility of conflict with my own son, the idea of allies felt both necessary and foreign. "Thank you, Helen. I may take you up on that." At home, I found a message on my answering machine from Patricia Monroe, her voice carrying the same artificial sweetness she'd employed Christmas night. "Richard, dear, I hope you're reconsidering our conversation. Gerald and I have been looking at other options, but nothing compares to the beauty and tranquility of your lake house. We take such good care of it and of you. Please call me when you get a moment." The presumption in her voice that my home was an option for her consideration, that her care was something I needed rather than something she was offering, made my jaw clench involuntarily. I deleted the message without writing down her number. That evening, I sat in Caroline's chair for the first time since her funeral, the green fabric soft under my hands, despite 3 years of careful preservation. The view from her spot was different from mine, centered on the garden she'd planted rather than the dock I'd built, focused on growth rather than structure. I tried to see the property through her eyes, to understand what she'd want me to do about the situation that was developing around me like a storm I couldn't quite predict or prevent. Caroline had never liked confrontation, but she'd never backed down from it either. When the county had tried to impose new septic regulations that would have cost us thousands in unnecessary upgrades, she'd attended every town meeting for 6 months until they revised the ordinance to grandfather in existing systems. When the insurance company had tried to deny coverage for my heart surgery, claiming it was a pre-existing condition, she'd spent hours on the phone with supervisors and medical reviewers until they reversed their decision. She'd fought for what mattered, but she'd fought smart, with preparation, with patience, with the kind of strategic thinking that won wars rather than just battles. I opened the manila folder and spread the contents across the coffee table: the deed, the insurance papers, the will that now seemed woefully inadequate to protect what we'd built together. Marcus was right about the legal vulnerabilities, but law was only one front in what was shaping up to be a larger campaign. The phone rang at 9:30, Ethan's number again. This time, I let it go to the machine, listening to his voice fill the quiet living room with words that sounded reasonable until you examined them closely. Dad, it's me. Look, I know we didn't end on the best note the other day, but I want you to know we're not trying to push you around. We're just trying to find a solution that works for everyone. Gerald and Patricia are willing to pay rent cover utilities, help with maintenance, whatever makes you comfortable. This could be good for all of us if you'll just give it a chance. Rent, utilities, maintenance. The language of landlord and tenant of business arrangement rather than family accommodation. I wondered if Ethan realized what he'd revealed about his true intentions or if the slip had been unconscious. I didn't call him back. Instead, I poured myself a glass of water and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the lake that had been our companion for 32 years. The water was beginning to freeze at the edges, winter claiming another piece of the landscape that would remain locked until spring released it. Tomorrow I would begin the process of protecting what Caroline and I had created together. Tonight, I allowed myself to remember what we'd built and why it was worth defending. Not just the house itself, but what it represented, the possibility that love could create something lasting, something that couldn't be taken away by force or manipulation, or the simple passage of time. The grandfather clock chimed 10 times, marking another day, survived another step taken toward whatever resolution awaited us all. In the photograph on the mantel, Caroline smiled with the confidence of a woman who'd never doubted that I would find a way to preserve what mattered most. I intended to prove her right. The trust documents arrived on a Thursday morning gray as pewter delivered in a manila envelope thick enough to feel substantial in my hands. Marcus had included a cover letter explaining the key provisions in language that cut through legal jargon like a blade through fog. The property would remain mine to control and occupy for the rest of my natural life. But upon my death, it would transfer to a charitable foundation dedicated to preserving historic properties, rather than to any individual heir. It was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. Ethan could contest my decision while I was alive, but he couldn't inherit what no longer existed to be inherited. I read through every page twice, my coffee growing cold, as I absorbed the full weight of what Marcus had constructed. The trust was ironclad, designed to withstand legal challenges and family pressure with equal effectiveness. More importantly, it gave me options I hadn't known existed, including the nuclear option of permanently removing the property from family inheritance if circumstances required such drastic action. The phone had been ringing more frequently since our Christmas confrontation calls from Madison that I let go to voicemail messages from Patricia that grew progressively less sweet and more demanding. Ethan himself hadn't called since his rent and utilities proposal, but his silence felt more ominous than his previous pressure. In my experience, when people like Ethan stopped talking, it usually meant they were planning something that couldn't be discussed in advance. I was reviewing the trust provisions for the third time when I heard the unmistakable sound of multiple car doors slamming in my driveway. Through the kitchen window, I watched Ethan emerge from his SUV, followed by Madison, Gerald, and Patricia. But this time, they weren't alone. A fifth figure stepped out of a second vehicle, a woman in her 50s wearing the kind of practical clothing that suggested she was accustomed to dealing with difficult situations. They moved toward my front door with the purposeful stride of people who'd rehearsed this moment, who'd planned their approach and assigned roles. The woman carried a clipboard and what looked like an official folder, her expression professionally neutral, in the way that suggested she was being paid to remain objective about whatever was about to unfold. The knot came firm and measured 3 sharp raps that seemed designed to convey authority rather than request permission. I folded the trust documents carefully before walking to the door, my pace deliberately unhurried, despite the adrenaline beginning to sing in my bloodstream. "Dad," Ethan said. When I opened the door, his smile bright, but strained around the edges. "We brought someone we'd like you to meet. This is Carol Andrews from Elder Care Solutions. She specializes in helping families navigate difficult transitions." Carol Andrews stepped forward, with the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to entering homes where she wasn't entirely welcome. "Mr. Dalton, I appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. Your family has expressed some concerns about your living situation, and I'm here to conduct a wellness assessment to help determine what services might be beneficial." Wellness assessment. The phrase hung in the air like smoke from a fire I couldn't quite locate, carrying implications that reached far beyond its innocent-sounding components. I'd heard similar language from social workers who'd visited neighbors over the years, professional evaluations that supposedly helped families make informed decisions about elderly care, but somehow always seemed to conclude that elderly people needed more supervision than they'd previously received. I wasn't aware I'd requested an assessment, I said, keeping my voice level despite the cold anger beginning to build in my chest. Sometimes family members notice changes that the individual might not be aware of, Carol said smoothly, consulting her clipboard with the practiced efficiency of someone who delivered this explanation many times before. Isolation difficult maintaining property challenges with daily living activities. It's perfectly normal, and there's no shame in needing support as we age. Behind her, I could see the others watching my reaction carefully. Gerald's expression carried the satisfied look of a man who believed he'd found the correct solution to an annoying problem. Patricia clutched her purse like armor, her mouth set in the determined line of someone prepared to see this through, regardless of my objections. Madison wore her sweetest smile, the one she used when she wanted something expensive or complicated. But it was Ethan's face that cut deepest. My son watched me with the clinical detachment of someone observing a problem to be solved, rather than a father to be respected. There was no warmth there, no apparent concern for my dignity or autonomy. Just the cool calculation of a man who decided that force was justified when persuasion had failed. "I don't need an assessment," I said firmly. "I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs." "That's what everyone says," Carol replied with the patient tone of someone accustomed to resistance. "But family members often notice things that—" "What things?" I interrupted. "What specifically have they told you that concerns them?" She glanced at Ethan, who nodded slightly, apparently giving her permission to proceed. "Isolation following your wife's death, possible depression, difficult maintaining this large property, resistance to accepting help from family members. These are all normal responses to loss and aging, but they can indicate a need for additional support." Each word felt like a small betrayal, my private grief and natural independence reframed as symptoms of decline. I could see the trap they'd constructed with careful precision. Any resistance to their plans would be interpreted as evidence that I lacked the judgment to make my own decisions. "I'm not isolated," I said. "I have friends, neighbors, a full social life when I choose to engage in it. I'm not depressed, I'm grieving, which is normal, 3 years after losing a spouse. I maintain my property myself because I'm capable of doing so. And I resist accepting help from family members when that help comes with strings attached that would cost me my independence." Carol made notes on her clipboard, her pen moving across the paper with mechanical precision. "Mr. Dalton, I appreciate your perspective, but sometimes family members have a clearer view of situation than the person living it," I finished. "That's convenient." Gerald stepped forward, his voice carrying the authoritative tone of a man accustomed to having his opinions treated as facts. "Richard, we're not trying to take anything away from you. We're trying to make sure you're safe, that you're not struggling alone when you don't have to. I'm not struggling. This house is too big for one person." Patricia added her artificial sweetness, finally giving way to something sharper. "The maintenance alone must be overwhelming. And what if something happened? What if you had a medical emergency? Who would know? Who would help?" They'd clearly rehearsed these arguments, polished them to sound reasonable rather than manipulative. But underneath the careful phrasing, I could hear the real message: you're too old, too alone, too stubborn to be trusted with your own life. "I have a medical alert system," I said. "I have neighbors who check on me. I have a cell phone and a landline and enough sense to call for help if I need it. What I don't have is any legal obligation to justify my living arrangements to people who want to take them over." Carol's pen paused over her clipboard. "Mr. Dalton, no one wants to take anything over. We're simply trying to assess whether additional support services might be beneficial. And if I refuse those services, that's certainly your right, as long as you're competent to make that decision." The qualifier hung in the air like a threat wrapped in professional language. As long as you're competent. The implication was clear. Refuse our help and we'll question your competence. Accept our help, and we'll gradually assume control over decisions that should remain yours. I looked at each of them in turn, seeing the careful choreography of this moment, the way they'd positioned themselves around me, like wolves around cornered prey. Ethan wore the expression of a dutiful son, concerned for his father's welfare. Madison radiated supportive concern. Gerald and Patricia projected the reasonable worry of extended family members. Carol Andrews maintained the professional neutrality of an objective observer, but I could see past their performances to the calculation underneath. This wasn't about my welfare or my safety or my need for support. This was about removing my ability to resist their plans, about creating an official record that would justify whatever steps they chose to take next. I think, I said slowly, that this conversation is over. Carol consulted her clipboard again, making additional notes with the practiced efficiency of someone who documented many similar encounters. Mr. Dalton, I appreciate your time. I'll be filing a report with the county's Aging Services Department, noting that a wellness check was requested by concerned family members and that you declined to participate in a full assessment. File whatever you want, I said, but do it from somewhere else. Ethan's mask slipped slightly, revealing the frustration he'd been working to conceal. Dad, you're making this harder than it needs to be. We're trying to help you. No, I said, my voice carrying the weight of 40 years spent dealing with people who confused what they wanted with what was right. You're trying to help yourselves, and you're using my age and my grief as weapons against me. The silence that followed was profound, the kind that reveals truths people had hoped to keep hidden. Carol Andrews cleared her throat diplomatically, apparently recognizing that her services would not be required today. Gerald's face flushed red above his expensive sweater. Patricia's mouth pinched into a line so thin it seemed to disappear entirely. But it was Madison's reaction that surprised me most. For just a moment her mask slipped too, revealing something that looked remarkably like shame before she caught herself and rearranged her expression into wounded disappointment. "We'll be in touch," Ethan said, finally his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I'm sure you will," I replied. They filed out in formation, Carol Andrews leading the way with her clipboard and her professional neutrality, the others following, in a line that suggested retreat rather than victory. I watched from the window as they conducted a brief conference beside their vehicles, voices low but gestures animated. Carol handed Gerald what looked like a business card before climbing into her own car and driving away. The others lingered longer, their conversation growing more heated, as they realized their carefully planned intervention had failed to achieve its intended result. Finally, they too drove away, leaving me alone with the silence and the growing certainty that this was far from over. I called Marcus immediately. "They brought a social worker," I told him without preamble. "Tried to conduct some kind of wellness assessment to document my supposed incompetence." "Did you submit to the assessment?" I threw them out. "Good. But Richard, this means they're escalating. They're building a paper trail to support a competency challenge or a guardianship petition." The words landed like physical blows, carrying the weight of legal precedent and family betrayal combined. How do I protect myself? Document everything, every contact, every attempt at manipulation, every conversation. Get a medical evaluation from your own doctor confirming your competence. And Richard, we need to finalize that trust as soon as possible. If they're moving this fast, we can't afford to wait. After we hung up, I sat in Caroline's chair and tried to process what had just happened. My own son had brought a stranger into my home to evaluate my fitness to live in it. He'd collaborated with virtual strangers to document my supposed deficiencies, to create an official record that could be used to justify removing my autonomy. The betrayal felt complete now, not just of my trust, but of everything Caroline and I had taught him about family loyalty and respect for elders. The boy who'd once cried in my arms after losing his first Little League game had grown into a man who could look me in the eye while arranging for my effective imprisonment. But betrayal, I was learning, could be a teacher as well as a wound. It could strip away illusions and reveal truths that comfort had kept hidden. It could show you who people really were when their wants exceeded their conscience. I pulled out a yellow legal pad and began making notes documenting the visit with the kind of precise detail I'd once used for construction estimates. Carol Andrews Elder Care Solutions. Clipboard questions about isolation and property maintenance. Gerald's flush of anger when I refused to cooperate. Patricia's demand that I justify my living arrangements. Ethan's clinical detachment as he watched strangers evaluate his father's competence. Each detail was a brick in the wall I was building to protect myself. Each observation a piece of evidence that this wasn't about my welfare, but about their convenience. They wanted me manageable, compliant, grateful for whatever accommodations they chose to provide. They'd chosen the wrong man to break. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the tracks left by their vehicles, erasing the evidence of intrusion. But inside, I felt something hardening that had been soft, too long, something sharpening that had grown dull from disuse. They thought I was weak because I was old, vulnerable, because I was alone, defeated, because I was grieving. They were wrong on all counts. The fight was just beginning, and I intended to win it. The medical evaluation, Dr. Patterson conducted the following. Monday was thorough enough to satisfy a courtroom, and comprehensive enough to demolish any claims about my supposed incompetence. Blood pressure, normal for my age. Reflexes sharp, cognitive function testing, in the 95th percentile for men over 70. Most importantly, his written report used language that would resonate with judges and social workers. Mr. Dalton demonstrates excellent judgment, clear reasoning, and full capacity for independent living and decision-making. I tucked the medical report into the manila folder that was growing thicker by the day, adding it to the trust documents property deed and detailed notes about each interaction with Ethan's coalition. Marcus had been right about documentation. Every conversation, every visit, every attempt at manipulation would become ammunition if this escalated to legal proceedings. The escalation came sooner than I'd expected. Wednesday brought a certified letter from the county's Adult Protective Services Department official language wrapped around unofficial pressure. A report has been filed expressing concern about your welfare and living situation. We are required by law to conduct a follow-up investigation within 10 business days. Please contact our office to schedule a convenient time for a home visit. The letter was signed by someone named Janet Morrison, Program Supervisor, and included a phone number with an extension that suggested this was routine business for them. I wondered how many elderly people received similar letters, how many families used official channels to resolve unofficial disputes about inheritance and control. I called Marcus before calling Janet Morrison. "It's escalating," I told him. "Adult Protective Services wants to conduct a home visit." "Expected but not welcome," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who'd seen this script performed too many times. "They're creating an official record of concern that can be used to justify more aggressive intervention later. What do I do? Cooperate fully, but on your terms. Schedule the visit for a time when I can be present. Prepare your home to demonstrate your competence, organized, clean, well-maintained. Have all your documentation ready to show you're managing your affairs properly. And if they recommend services I don't want, politely decline. You're not required to accept help you don't need, but document your reasons carefully. We want to show that your decisions are rational and well-considered, not arbitrary or defensive." The home visit was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 10 in the morning. I spent the weekend preparing with the kind of methodical precision I'd once brought to construction projects, understanding that details would matter more than broad impressions when official reports were being written. I cleaned the house from top to bottom, not because it was dirty, but because I wanted it to gleam with the kind of careful maintenance that contradicted any claims about my inability to manage the property. I organized my medications in clearly labeled containers, updated my calendar with doctor's appointments and social activities, arranged my financial documents in neat folders that demonstrated fiscal responsibility and mental acuity. Most importantly, I prepared responses to the questions I knew they'd ask about my daily routine, my support network, my plans for aging in place. Every answer needed to sound thoughtful, rather than defensive, confident, rather than stubborn. Janet Morrison arrived precisely on time, accompanied by a younger woman introduced as Sarah Chen, a social work intern who would be observing the visit for training purposes. Both women wore the professional neutrality that suggested they had conducted many similar evaluations. But Janet's eyes carried the sharper focus of someone who'd learned to distinguish between legitimate concern and family manipulation. Marcus had arrived 15 minutes earlier, his presence transforming the visit from an interrogation into a consultation. He sat quietly in Caroline's chair, taking notes, but not interfering, letting me demonstrate my competence through my own words and actions. "Mr. Dalton," Janet began, settling onto the sofa with a clipboard that seemed smaller and less threatening than Carol Andrews had been. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us. I want to emphasize that this is an informal assessment, not an investigation. We're simply responding to concerns that have been raised about your welfare. I appreciate that, I said, keeping my tone cooperative but not deferential. Though I should mention that the concerns seem to come primarily from family members who have their own reasons for wanting me to change my living situation. Janet's pen paused over her clipboard, a small tell that suggested she'd heard similar statements before. Can you tell me about those reasons? I described the Christmas confrontation, the demand that I house Gerald and Patricia Monroe, the pressure tactics that had escalated into bringing Carol Andrews to evaluate my competence. I kept my tone factual rather than emotional, letting the events speak for themselves, rather than editorializing about my son's motivations. And how would you characterize your current living situation? Sarah asked, her voice carrying the earnestness of someone new to this work. Comfortable, sustainable, and entirely appropriate for my needs, I replied. I maintain the property myself, manage my own finances, drive my own vehicle, shop for my own groceries. I have a strong support network of neighbors and friends, regular medical care, and all the emergency systems any reasonable person my age should have. Janet made notes while Sarah looked around the living room, her gaze taking in the organized bookshelves, the clean furniture, the family photographs that suggested a life well lived rather than a decline poorly managed. We'd like to take a look around the house, if that's acceptable, Janet said, just to get a sense of how you're managing the physical space. I led them through each room, pointing out the safety features I'd installed over the years, grab bars in the bathrooms, improved lighting in the stairwells, the medical alert system that connected directly to emergency services. The house revealed itself as what it was, the carefully maintained home of a competent adult who'd planned for aging in place rather than simply hoping for the best. In the kitchen, I showed them the organized pantry, the labeled medications, the calendar that tracked appointments and activities. Sarah commented on the garden visible through the window, noting that someone was clearly tending it with skill and attention. That's my work, I said. My wife designed the layout, but I've maintained it since her passing. Keeps me active and gives me a reason to be outdoors regularly. Back in the living room, Janet consulted her notes before asking the question I'd been waiting for. Mr. Dalton, your family has suggested that you might benefit from having other people living here, both for companionship and for assistance with property maintenance. How do you feel about that suggestion? It was the crucial moment, the one where my answer would determine whether this visit ended with recommendations for independence or intervention. I'd rehearsed various responses, but in the moment I chose simple honesty. I understand their concern, I said, but I don't share their assessment of my needs. I'm not socially isolated. I choose solitude when it suits me and seek company when I want it. I'm not struggling with property maintenance. I hire help for tasks beyond my capabilities and handle everything else myself. What they're offering isn't assistance, it's displacement. They want to move virtual strangers into my home and expect me to be grateful for the loss of my privacy and autonomy. Marcus nodded almost imperceptibly, a small signal that I was hitting the right notes. Janet made more notes, her expression giving nothing away. And if circumstances changed, Sarah asked. If you did need assistance at some point in the future, then I'd evaluate my options and make appropriate decisions, I replied. I'm not opposed to change when change is necessary. I'm opposed to being forced to change to accommodate other people's preferences rather than my own needs. The visit lasted another 30 minutes, during which they reviewed my documentation, asked about my social connections, and verified my understanding of local emergency services. When they finally packed up their clipboards and folders, Janet's expression had shifted from neutral assessment to something approaching approval. Mr. Dalton, she said, based on what I've observed today, I see no indicators that would suggest you need immediate intervention or services. You appear to be managing your affairs competently and maintaining your property appropriately. I'll be filing a report that reflects those observations. After they left, Marcus and I sat in the quiet living room while I processed what had just happened. I'd passed their test, demonstrated my competence, protected my independence for now, but the victory felt fragile, temporary, like a reprieve rather than a resolution. They'll try something else, Marcus said, echoing my own thoughts. This was just the first probe. When official channels don't give them what they want, families like this often get creative. What kind of creative? Financial pressure if they can find leverage. Medical manipulation if they can get doctors to support their concerns. Legal challenges to your competency, though, that's harder after a positive APS evaluation. He closed his briefcase with the decisive snap of a man who'd seen this script before. The key is to stay ahead of them, to anticipate their moves and prepare our responses. That evening, I called Helen Morrison to update her on the situation. Her response was immediate and fierce. "Richard Dalton, that boy of yours has lost his mind if he thinks he can push you around like this. You just let me know if you need anything. Witness's character references a place to stay if things get ugly." The offer of sanctuary touched me in ways I hadn't expected. For 3 years, I'd been managing my grief and solitude as private matters, accepting casseroles and condolences, but keeping my deeper struggles to myself. Now, facing the possibility of extended conflict with my own family, the idea of allies felt both necessary and precious. That night, I sat on the deck, despite the cold, wrapped in one of Caroline's quilts, and watching the stars reflect on the dark water of Clearview Lake. The temperature was dropping toward freezing, but the air was still peaceful in the way that only winter nights could be. I thought about the visitors who'd paraded through my home in recent weeks. Carol Andrews with her clipboard and professional concern, Janet Morrison with her government authority and careful neutrality, Ethan with his calculated worry and hidden agenda. All of them had looked at my life from the outside, forming judgments based on partial information and their own assumptions about what people my age needed or deserved. None of them had bothered to ask what I actually wanted. What I wanted was simple: to live out my remaining years in the home Caroline and I had built together, surrounded by our shared memories and the accumulated treasures of a life well lived. To wake up each morning to the sight of the lake, we'd love to tend the garden she'd designed, to sit in the chairs we'd chosen together while watching the seasons change. I wanted autonomy without isolation, independence without abandonment, respect without pity. I wanted to be seen as a man who'd earned the right to make his own decisions, rather than a problem to be managed by people who confused their convenience with my needs. The trust documents were signed and filed, now the legal protections in place to prevent anyone from inheriting what they hadn't earned the right to preserve. My medical competence was officially documented. My living situation had been evaluated and approved by county authorities. But I could feel the storm still gathering at the edges of my carefully ordered life pressure building, like the kind of weather front that promised to test every structure it encountered. Ethan and his coalition wouldn't stop. Here, wouldn't accept defeat from social workers and county bureaucrats. They'd regroup, revise their strategy, find new ways to apply pressure until something gave way. The difference was that now I was ready for them. Now I understood the rules of the game they had forced me to play, and I intended to play it better than they expected, from a man they'd dismissed as too old and too broken to defend himself. The grandfather clock chimed 11 times, its voice steady and imperturbable in the winter quiet. I folded Caroline's quilt carefully and went inside, checking the locks, setting the alarm system, performing the small rituals that marked the end of another day survived. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new attempts at manipulation or coercion. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, protected by law and determination in equal measure. The fight was far from over, but I was no longer fighting it alone. The envelope arrived on a Thursday morning in February, thick and official, bearing the letterhead of Caldwell Morrison and Associates, a law firm I'd never heard of, but whose reputation Marcus filled in for me over the phone with grim efficiency. They specialize in elder law. He said, his voice carrying the weight of bad news delivered professionally. Specifically, they handle competency challenges and guardianship proceedings. "Richard, this is serious." I spread the legal documents across my kitchen table, the morning light catching on letterhead that seemed designed to intimidate rather than inform. The petition was dense with legal language, but its core message emerged with crystalline clarity. Ethan Dalton was requesting that the court declare me incompetent to manage my own affairs and appoint him as my legal guardian. The supporting affidavit painted a picture of decline that would have been laughable if it hadn't been so calculated. According to my son's sworn statement, I exhibited increasing isolation and paranoia, resistance to accepting necessary assistance, poor judgment regarding property maintenance, and inability to recognize my own limitations. Carol Andrews had provided a supplementary report noting my defensive attitude and unrealistic assessment of my capabilities. Most damaging was a statement from Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a geriatric psychiatrist I'd never met, who'd somehow formed opinions about my mental state based on family reports and behavioral observations. Her conclusion: While Mr. Dalton may appear superficially competent in structured interactions, family members report concerning changes in judgment and reasoning that suggest early cognitive decline. The document felt surreal in my hands, a legal fiction constructed from half-truths and professional manipulation. But Marcus reminded me that surreal didn't mean ineffective judges saw these petitions regularly, and some were inclined to err on the side of caution when families expressed concern about elderly relatives. "How do we fight this?" I asked. "With everything we have," Marcus replied grimly. "We'll need current medical evaluations, psychological testing character, witnesses' financial records showing competent management. We'll need to demonstrate not just that you're capable, but that this petition is motivated by greed rather than genuine concern." The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks away, which meant 6 weeks of preparation and 6 weeks of living, with the knowledge that my own son was trying to have me legally declared incompetent. The irony wasn't lost on me. The boy I'd taught to think critically and question authority was now using the very systems of authority to silence his father's questions about his motives. I threw myself into preparation with the methodical intensity I'd once brought to complex construction projects. Dr. Patterson arranged for comprehensive neurological testing that confirmed what I already knew: my cognitive function was normal for my age. My judgment sound, my capacity for independent decision-making, unimpaired. I gathered financial records showing 40 years of responsible money management, character references from neighbors and friends, documentation of my active involvement in community organizations. But the most important preparation was emotional rather than legal. I had to accept that, regardless of the hearing's outcome, my relationship with Ethan was effectively over. The son who'd once trusted me enough to ask for bedtime stories about the houses I'd built had grown into a man who could swear under oath that I was mentally incompetent. The realization brought a strange kind of peace, the clarity that comes when you stop fighting reality and start planning for it instead. 3 weeks before the hearing, I called Marcus with a request that surprised even me. "I want to activate the nuclear option," I said. "Richard, you don't have to decide that now. We can win this case without... Maybe we can, maybe we can't. But either way, I'm done playing defense. It's time to take control of the narrative." The press conference was Marcus's idea, a way to reframe the story before Ethan's lawyers could control how it was told. We held it at the lakehouse on a crisp March morning, the property looking its best in the spring light that turned Clearview Lake into a mirror reflecting Caroline's garden, beginning to wake from winter dormancy. I'd invited the local newspaper, the regional TV stations, and a freelance journalist who specialized in elder rights issues. Not a large audience, but large enough to ensure that the story would be told from my perspective, rather than filtered through legal proceedings designed to minimize my voice. I stood on the deck Caroline and I had built together, looking out at faces that carried the professional curiosity of reporters who'd covered their share of family disputes. Behind me, Marcus arranged documents on a small table: the trust papers, the medical evaluations, the character references that painted a picture very different from the one Ethan's lawyers had constructed. "My name is Richard Dalton." I began, my voice carrying easily across the water. 73 years old, widowed 3 years ago, living independently in the home my wife and I built together 32 years ago. 6 weeks from now, my son will ask a judge to declare me mentally incompetent and appoint him as my guardian. I'm here today to tell you why that petition is not about my welfare. It's about his inheritance. I told the story chronologically, letting the facts speak for themselves. The Christmas confrontation, the pressure to house virtual strangers, the escalation to social workers, and legal challenges when I refused to comply. I showed them the medical evaluations that confirmed my competence, the property maintenance records that documented my capability, the trust documents that protected the property from exactly the kind of manipulation Ethan was attempting. But I saved the best for last. "Today," I said, pulling out a folder I'd kept separate from the others, "I'm announcing my decision to donate this property to the Clearview Veterans Foundation, effective immediately. The donation includes lifetime occupancy rights for myself, but removes the property permanently from any inheritance dispute." The reporters straightened pens, moving faster across notebooks. This was news, not just another family squabble over money and control. The property will be used to provide temporary housing for veterans transitioning back to civilian life, I continued. It will serve families who've served our country rather than being fought over by people who've never served anything but their own interests. Yet I could see the wheels turning in their minds, calculating the human interest angles, the broader implications about elder rights and family manipulation. A son trying to seize his father's property was one story. A father donating that property to veterans to prevent family greed was a much better one. The questions came fast and sharp. Had I consulted with Ethan before making this decision? No. And why would I? Did I expect this to end the legal challenge I expected it to make, the challenge irrelevant? What message did I want to send to other families facing similar situations, that elderly people have the right to make their own decisions about their own property, regardless of what their children might prefer? The best question came from Sarah Martinez, the freelance journalist who specialized in elder rights. Mr. Dalton, some people might say you're being vindictive, that you're punishing your son for caring about your welfare. I looked directly into the camera lens that was recording her question. Caring about my welfare would have meant asking what I wanted, rather than telling me what I needed. Caring about my welfare would have meant respecting my autonomy, rather than questioning my competence. What my son has done isn't care, it's control. And I'm too old and too tired to pretend there's a difference. The story ran that evening on the local news, picked up by regional stations the next day, and found its way onto social media platforms where it resonated with adult children, dealing with aging parents and elderly people fighting to maintain their independence. The narrative had shifted decisively in my favor, from a confused old man resisting necessary help to a competent adult defending his rights against family exploitation. More importantly, the donation had accomplished exactly what I'd intended. Ethan's guardianship petition became legally meaningless the moment I no longer owned the property he wanted to control. His lawyers could still pursue the case, but they'd be fighting for the right to manage assets that no longer existed in any form he could inherit. The call came 3 days after the press conference, Ethan's voice tight with rage barely held in check. "You destroyed everything," he said without preamble. 40 years of family history gone, just to spite me. "I preserved 40 years of family history," I replied calmly. "I just made sure it couldn't be turned into a commodity by people who never understood its value." "You're out of your mind. You know that, right? Giving away millions of dollars in property just to hurt me." "I gave away property to help people who deserved it more than you do. The fact that it hurts you is a side effect, not the goal." This isn't over," he said, his voice carrying the same threat he'd made after the Christmas confrontation. "You think you've won something, but you've just made everything worse. For you, maybe. For me, it's over. The property is protected, my rights are secured, and I no longer have to waste energy wondering what you'll try next." The line went dead, leaving me alone with the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. Outside, early spring was asserting itself over winter's retreat, Caroline's garden showing the first green shoots of another cycle of growth and renewal. I walked out to the dock and sat in one of the Adirondack chairs looking across Clearview Lake at a landscape that remained mine to enjoy, but no longer mine to worry about preserving. The Veterans Foundation would take care of the property's future. I could focus on enjoying whatever future remained to me. Marcus had been right about one thing. Families like Ethan's often got creative when official channels failed them. But creativity required resources and motivation, and I'd just eliminated both. There was nothing left for Ethan to fight over, no inheritance to justify continued legal battles, no property to control. The guardianship hearing would still happen, but it had become an empty gesture, a legal proceeding without practical consequences. Ethan could win the right to manage my affairs, but my affairs no longer included the only asset he'd ever shown interest in controlling. 3 days later, his lawyers withdrew the petition without explanation, apparently recognizing that there was no point in pursuing guardianship over a man whose most valuable asset had been permanently removed from their client's reach. The silence that followed felt different from the quiet I'd grown accustomed to during 3 years of widowhood. This wasn't the absence of Caroline's voice. It was the absence of pressure manipulation and the constant low-level stress of knowing that people were plotting to take away what I valued most. For the first time since Christmas, I slept through the night without waking to check locks or listen for unfamiliar sounds in the driveway. The war was over, decided not by judges or social workers, but by my own choice to remove the prize they'd been fighting over. Ethan had taught me something valuable about the difference between family and blood, between love and control, between caring for someone and caring about what they owned. The lesson had been expensive. It had cost me my son and my illusions about family loyalty, but it had been worth every penny. Outside Spring continued its quiet revolution, transforming the landscape Caroline had designed into something new while preserving its essential character. Change and continuity both at once, the way life actually worked when you stopped trying to control every variable and started trusting in the possibility of renewal. The grandfather clock chimed noon, marking the middle of a day that belonged entirely to me, in a house that would remain mine until I no longer needed it, surrounded by memories that no legal proceeding could confiscate or distribute. I had won more than a battle. I had won back my peace. The silence that settled over my life after the legal dust cleared was different from any quiet I'd known before. It wasn't the hollow emptiness that had followed Caroline's death, nor the tense stillness that had preceded each confrontation with Ethan's coalition. This was the profound peace that comes when a man has drawn his final line and discovered he has the strength to defend it. Spring advanced across Clearview Lake with the patient certainty of seasons that had been changing long before my family drama and would continue long after. Caroline's garden responded to the warming earth with an enthusiasm that seemed almost personal, as if the plants understood they were now protected by something larger than individual ownership. The daffodils she'd planted 15 years ago pushed through the last patches of snow with yellow determination, followed by the tulips that would bloom in careful arrangements she'd designed to provide color from March through October. I tended them with the same methodical care I'd always shown, but now the work carried a different weight. These weren't just flowers I was nurturing for my own enjoyment. They were the beginning of a legacy that would outlast my personal stewardship. The Veterans Foundation had already sent representatives to discuss their plans for the property. Respectful men and women who understood the difference between preservation and change, who spoke about honoring the character of the place while adapting it for its new purpose. The first veteran would arrive in June, they told me. A young woman named Sarah Rodriguez, recently discharged from the Army, struggling with the transition to civilian life after 3 tours in Afghanistan. She'd have the guest bedroom Caroline and I had always hoped would house grandchildren, the one with windows that faced the garden and caught the morning light that made everything look possible. I found myself looking forward to the company more than I'd expected. Not because I was lonely. The months of legal battles had taught me the difference between solitude and isolation, but because Sarah Rodriguez represented something I'd lost faith in during the long winter of family betrayal, the possibility that helping someone could be motivated by genuine care rather than calculated self-interest. The phone still rang occasionally, but the calls had changed in character. Instead of demands masquerading as concern, I received genuine offers of friendship from neighbors who'd followed the story in the local paper. Helen Morrison called weekly now, not to check on my competence, but to share gossip and plan small social activities that reminded me I was still part of a community that extended beyond the boundaries of blood relationship. Marcus called regularly, too, partly from professional habit and partly from what seemed to be genuine friendship. The legal battle had revealed qualities in both of us that mere business relationships don't usually uncover: his fierce dedication to protecting clients who couldn't protect themselves, my apparently inexhaustible capacity for strategic thinking when pushed to my limits. "You know," he said during one of our Thursday afternoon conversations, "I've been practicing law for 35 years, and I've never seen anyone solve a family dispute quite the way you did. Most people get trapped in the emotional dynamics and lose sight of the practical solutions. Most people probably love their children more than I love mine." I replied, the words carrying less bitterness than I'd expected. Time and distance had a way of transforming even profound disappointment into something more manageable, more philosophical. "I don't think it's about loving them less," Marcus said thoughtfully. "I think it's about understanding that love without boundaries isn't actually love, it's enablement." The observation stayed with me as I moved through my daily routines, tending the garden, maintaining the house, reading the books Caroline had always meant to discuss with me, but never found time for. Boundaries. The word carried weight I was still learning to appreciate. For most of my adult life, I'd equated good parenting with unlimited availability, unconditional support, reflexive accommodation of my child's needs and wants. The legal battle had taught me that boundaries weren't walls built to keep love out. They were foundations that made genuine love possible by distinguishing it from manipulation, obligation, and fear. On a warm afternoon in late April, I was replacing a loose board on the dock when a familiar SUV pulled into my driveway. For a moment, muscle memory triggered the old tension, the automatic preparation for conflict that had become habitual during the winter months. Then, I recognized the driver and felt something more complicated than simple relief. Madison emerged from the vehicle alone, her expensive coat replaced by jeans and a simple sweater that made her look younger and somehow more vulnerable. She approached the dock with hesitant steps, like someone walking across ice she wasn't certain would support her weight. "Richard," she said, stopping at the edge of the lawn where it met the wooden planking. "I hope it's all right that I came by." I set down my hammer and studied her face, looking for signs of the calculated sweetness that had characterized our previous interactions. What I saw instead was something I hadn't expected: shame, genuine and apparently deeply felt. "It's your choice," I said, neither welcoming nor dismissive. "What do you want to talk about?" She glanced back at her vehicle as if considering retreat, then walked onto the dock with the deliberate steps of someone who'd rehearsed this moment, but wasn't confident about her lines. "I wanted to apologize," she said simply, "for all of it. For the pressure for bringing my parents into your home without invitation, for supporting Ethan when I should have known better." The words hung in the air between us, unadorned by the artificial sweetness that had made her previous statements feel manipulative. This was different, raw, uncomfortable, apparently authentic. "What changed your mind?" I asked. Madison sat on the edge of the dock, her feet dangling toward the water like a child's. "The newspaper article. Seeing our behavior described in print, seeing how it looked to people who didn't have anything to gain from the outcome." She paused, watching a pair of ducks navigate the shallows near the shore. "I realized we'd turned you into the villain in a story where you were actually the victim." The acknowledgement was more than I'd expected from any member of Ethan's coalition, but I found myself reluctant to accept it too quickly. Trust once broken required more than words to repair. "And Ethan, does he share your change of perspective?" Her laugh was short and bitter. "Ethan thinks you've lost your mind. He's convinced himself that everything you did was evidence of cognitive decline, that a competent person would have given us what we wanted." She looked up at me with eyes that seemed clearer than I remembered them being. "He can't accept that you understood exactly what we were doing and chose to stop us. What about your parents? They're not speaking to me. Apparently coming here to apologize makes me a traitor to family interests." Her voice carried a weariness that suggested this conversation had cost her more than just time and gasoline. "But I needed to say this, Richard. I needed you to know that at least one person involved understands how badly we behaved." I picked up my hammer and turned it in my hands, feeling the familiar weight of a tool worn smooth by decades of honest work. Madison's apology felt genuine, but it also felt like something that belonged to the past, rather than pointing toward any particular future. "I appreciate you coming," I said finally. "It takes courage to admit mistakes, especially when admitting them doesn't change their consequences." "Is there any chance?" she began, then stopped herself. "No, that's not fair to ask." "What?" "I was going to ask if there was any chance you'd reconsider the donation, if we could find some way to work together that respected your autonomy." She shook her head. "But that's not really about making amends, is it? That's about wanting a different outcome." The distinction revealed more emotional intelligence than I'd credited her with during our previous interactions. Perhaps the pressure to support her husband's schemes had obscured qualities that were more apparent when she was speaking for herself, rather than representing family interests. "The donation stands," I said gently. "Not because I'm angry with you, but because it's the right choice for the property's future. Sarah Rodriguez will take better care of this place than anyone motivated by inheritance would." Madison nodded, apparently having expected that answer. "Will you tell her about the garden? About how Caroline designed it to provide color through all the seasons?" The request surprised me with its thoughtfulness, its implicit understanding that the property's value lay in more than just square footage and lake frontage. "I will." She stood brushing dirt from her jeans with the careful movements of someone preparing to leave a place they might never see again. At the edge of the dock, she turned back with one final observation. "For what it's worth, Richard, Caroline would be proud of how you handled this. She never let anyone push her around either." After Madison drove away, I sat in one of the Adirondack chairs and watched the afternoon light slant across water that held the reflections of clouds and possibilities in equal measure. Her apology had been unexpected, But ultimately, beside the point, the damage had been done. The choices made, the consequences accepted by everyone involved. But her recognition of Caroline's character in my actions touched something I hadn't realized needed touching. For months, I'd wondered whether my decisions honored my wife's memory or betrayed it, whether protecting our home from family manipulation was what she would have wanted, or simply what my anger demanded. Madison's observation suggested that maybe Caroline would have understood. Maybe she would have approved of drawing lines that protected what we'd built together from people who saw it only as something to be acquired and controlled. That evening, I called the Veterans Foundation to finalize the details of Sarah Rodriguez's arrival. She'd be coming in early June, they told me, staying for up to 6 months while she completed a certification program that would help her transition into civilian employment. She was quiet, they said, respectful of others' space, but grateful for any guidance about adjusting to life outside the military structure. I found myself planning for her arrival with the same careful attention Caroline had once brought to, preparing for guests, thinking about which towels to put in her bathroom, whether the guest room needed fresh paint, what groceries to stock for someone whose dietary preferences I didn't yet know. The planning felt good in ways I hadn't anticipated, not because I needed someone to take care of, but because taking care of someone whose motives I didn't have to question restored my faith in the possibility of uncomplicated human kindness. As May advanced toward June, the garden reached the peak of its spring display, Caroline's design revealing itself in waves of color that would have made her proud. The house felt ready for its new purpose, the property prepared to serve people who would appreciate it without trying to own it. I was ready too, ready to share the space Caroline and I had created, ready to discover what came after victory, ready to learn whether the peace I'd fought for would prove as satisfying as the fight itself. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, marking another day's end in a life that had become my own again. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, new conversations, new reasons to believe that some stories have better endings than their beginnings might suggest. Outside, night settled over Clearview Lake, with the gentle certainty of seasons that had been changing long before my personal drama and would continue long after. The water held the last light of day like a promise that tomorrow would bring its own illumination, its own chances for grace. I was ready for whatever came next. Where are you watching this video from? Leave your location.